Hey folks, welcome back for another build video where we're looking at the true Patriot gear set paired with the perfect Vanguard skill and the perfect Galvanized skill. And all of these components are geared specifically at running a support build for the Countdown game mode, which for anyone who hasn't already played it, it is an 8-player mode where the focus is taking back a nuclear power plant from an enemy faction. One of these days we'll put together a how-to video for Countdown, but until then, don't run your offensive skills on infill or exfil, and let's get into this build. For our specialization, we've gone with the Technician for the amped talent, giving us +1 skill tier to our chem launcher, and additionally providing us with the linked laser pointer to put on our Kingbreaker, which is of course our primary weapon on this build, and this is certainly more of a 1A, 1B situation. You're going to use both the Kingbreaker and the Scorpio shotgun in that secondary slot there, a decent amount during a Countdown run. The Kingbreaker we put on here for the perfect flatline talent, coupled with the linked laser pointer, provides plus 20% weapon damage to pulsed enemies. For a secondary weapon, we have the Scorpio shotgun. It's a bit of a misnomer to call it a secondary weapon, as you will be using both of these a significant amount, even though you are much more of a support build in the Countdown setup with this build. The Scorpio still puts out a significant amount of damage, and even more crucially, with the Septic Shock talent, you can disorient and shock targets, both of which proc the perfect Galvanized talent on your backpack. And then for our sidearm, we've gone with the TDI card custom, just for, again, that +1 skill tier can be used situationally to get you an additional charge for your chem launcher, though ultimately you're going to be relying on your primary and secondary weapons most often. For our mask, we have our first piece of True Patriot gear. We'll run through all of the bonuses here. At 2 pieces, you get plus 30% ammo capacity. 3 pieces gives you plus 30% mag size. And then at 4 pieces, you unlock the red, white, and blue talent. Every 2 seconds, enemies you shoot receive a stacking debuff of red, white, and blue. Red amplifies the enemy's damage taken by 8%. White, shooting the enemy repairs the attacking agent's armor by 2% once every second. Blue decreases the enemy damage dealt by 8%, and full flag, enemies that die while under the effect of all 3 debuffs create a 5-meter explosion, dealing damage equal to their total health and armor. And explosion damage is reduced on named enemy deaths. But given how clustered enemies are, the full flag talent actually comes into effect more often than I would have expected prior to testing this build out. Though of course, ultimately the major benefits of this build are amplifying the enemy's damage taken by 8%. That's going to be big for you and all of the group members that you're running with. And also the blue talent there, decreasing enemy damage dealt by 8%, also really helps, especially with the hunters on both the infiltration and extraction phases of Countdown. And then I'll go ahead and show it here so I can skip over it later. All of the True Patriot gear pieces here are going to have a core attribute of armor, a secondary attribute of headshot damage, and where applicable, we have headshot damage in the mod slot as well. The armor core here is boosting the overall benefit you give from both the Vanguard and Galvanized talents here. And then because we're losing so many secondary attributes, but we still want to do some amount of weapon damage if we can, I've gone with headshot damage here. I actually find it works much better with gear sets than a crit build, unless you're specifically building into that. And given how many close range encounters you're going to have during a Countdown session, headshot damage isn't too hard to keep control of. You're really right up against the enemy, so you can just aim at their head and fire away. For backpack, we have the Lavoze, which is the named electric backpack. It comes with a core attribute of a skill tier. And then down there we have secondary attributes of headshot damage and status effects. The status effects here help increase the duration of the ensnare, confuse, and shock that you're applying, but ultimately, if you wanted to go a different route, say some weapon handling there, that's also an equally viable choice. And then again in the mod slot, we have headshot damage, and then of course for the talent there, we have perfect Galvanize, applying blind, ensnare, confuse, or shock to an enemy grants 50% of your armor as bonus armor to you, and more importantly for this build, to your allies within 30 meters of that enemy for 10 seconds. One thing to note here, if you would rather, you could go with a brand set that naturally has a core attribute of armor and instead put normal Galvanize on the backpack. The 2 main reasons I didn't go that route are, 1, even though your overall armor count is higher, 40% of 1.8 is less than 50% of 1.6. And those are of course rough numbers there, but the math does check out. Ultimately, you're going to be giving less bonus armor to your allies every time you proc Galvanize, and then on top of that, and maybe a little bit more crucially, you also lose an additional 10 meters of effectiveness for this talent. As you can see, the perfect version increases the radius of the talent from 20 to 30 meters, which is ultimately why I went with the perfect galvanized, even though of course it does have a skill tier naturally as a core attribute. Obviously, if you get perfect secondary attributes, you could roll that core to an armor core, but I find that can be difficult to do for people just trying to farm for these pieces just to try them out. So I'm showing this build as is just to show that it is, of course, still very effective, and of course there is room for improvement if you want to change that skill tier to an armor core on this backpack. And here we have the Point Man, which is the named chest piece from Guard. The brand bonus there gives us an additional 5% total armor, which boosts the effectiveness of both Vanguard and Galvanize. And then here we again have a core attribute of armor and then secondary attributes of headshot damage and weapon handling down here. And then again in the mod slot we've gone with some more headshot damage. Like I mentioned on the backpack, I think that secondary attribute slot could either be weapon handling or status effects. Ultimately, it just kind of depends how you want to go with this build. And here for the talent, we have Perfect Vanguard. Deploying a shield makes it invulnerable for 5 seconds and grants 50% of your armor as bonus armor to all other allies for 20 seconds. And the cooldown on that is 25 seconds. But as we just read there, it has no range limit. So as soon as you deploy your shield, presuming that you're not within that 25-second cooldown window, you will automatically give 50% of your armor as bonus armor to everybody, which can be particularly useful if you're not right next to your ally. If you're monitoring their armor and it's getting a little bit low, you can just whip your shield out just to help them stay up and move through the encounter that much easier. And then of course it's also worth pointing out that the Perfect Vanguard only gives an increase of 5% over the normal version, so either one is perfectly viable, but obviously if you can get your hands on the Point Man chest piece, I would recommend that over the normal version for this build. And then for our gloves, holster, and knee pads here, we have an identical setup. You get the 2, 3, and 4-piece bonuses out of these pieces. And then of course, as we mentioned with the mask, we have a core attribute of armor and a secondary attribute of headshot damage there. Ultimately, given that this is a support build, if you would rather go a different route with your secondary attribute, the one that immediately comes to mind would be status effects, just to increase the effectiveness of your Riot Foam Chem Launcher. You could certainly do that, but ultimately I find that having some headshot damage piled on there helps compensate for a pretty much full armor core build and does allow you to contribute in a damage output perspective and not just a defensive one. But again, that is something of a preferential pick, and some would argue that it's a little bit wasted. So if you want to go a different route with your secondary attributes, you certainly can, but this is what I would recommend. Again, given that you're giving up one of your secondary attribute slots because it is a gear set, it is much easier to stack into headshot damage and get the full benefit of that, as opposed to having to split them between crit hit damage and crit hit chance to make that effective. And then for our skills here, we have the Riot Foam Chem Launcher. The Riot Foam applies Ensnare, which also procs Galvanize. And then of course for the secondary skill, we're going to have to go with a shield of some type here, and given that we're going to try and maintain use of our primary and secondary weapons throughout Countdown, we've gone with the Crusader Ballistic Shield here. Switching back to our first skill slot here, it is worth bringing up a different specialization option at this time. If you wanted to go with the Gunner instead of the Technician, you could get access to the Banshee Pole, which applies Disorient and also procs Galvanize. So either one are certainly viable options to go with here. But for my money, the additional skill tier and the increased ammo count kind of made the difference here and made my decision. But obviously that is something I want to bring up with the first skill here. If you're a big fan of the Banshee Pulse, you could certainly use it with this build and make it very effective as well. And as one last note, make sure you're paying extra close attention to your group when you run a build like this, because while it is really helpful to have one person running a more defensive tanky build like this that can provide a lot of extra armor to your group mates when they need it, if too many people are running a build like this, your overall damage output is going to be too low to easily clear Countdown, particularly on heroic difficulty. So that is the slight addendum to this video. It's a nice change of pace and a different skill set to be able to run support for Countdown, but at the same time, make sure you're paying close attention, because if you have too many of this kind of build, it can make it very difficult to complete Countdown and can definitely slow down the clear times, which for those people who are running specifically to try and farm specific gear, you want to make sure you're being considerate of them as well. But ultimately, I do stand behind this build as a great support build for the Countdown game mode. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. Please try this one out. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know if you would put it together any differently. Obviously, this is a very armor core focused build, so the offensive output isn't going to be where normal builds are at. But for those of you out there who liked the more support-focused builds, I hope you found this one intriguing. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, please tell your friends about the channel so you can continue to help us grow, and we will see you in the next one.
System curtailed. System malfunctioning. Target approaching. Area secure.
Agent, you should be able to access the turbine now.
Destroy that thing!
Critical systems exposed. Data transfer halted. Incoming. High-risk hostile. Area secure. Evacuate the facility. 5 minutes to lockdown.
Warning. Fault detected with transformer. Safety protocols activated.
You're gonna need to expose the transformer and remove any busted fuses.
System restored. Rogue fixer drone detected. Hostile fixer drone detected now. Rogue striker drone detected. Hostile striker drone detected. Rogue restorer high.
get you home, Agent.
Sending out UAV now.
You saved the plant.